You're listening to The Problem with Poverty, a podcast that helps bring awareness to the causes and consequences of poverty, as well as ways that we can overcome the problems with poverty together. Our company, Community Action Partnership of North Alabama, serves 28 counties in our beautiful state. According to 2019 estimates by the U.S. Census, Alabama was the seventh poorest state with 15.5% of its residents living in poverty, as compared with a U.S. average of 11.1%. Our goal with this show is to highlight all of the opportunities that we and our partners have to help people overcome poverty as we focus on helping people, changing lives.
Welcome to the Problem with Poverty podcast. I'm your host, Holly Hicks. Our guest today is Stephanie Owens, Family Service Manager for the Department of Children's Services at Community Action Partnership of North Alabama. Stephanie holds a bachelor's degree in social work from the University of North Alabama. She's an instructor for Temple University's Credential for Strengths-Based Family Workers to help staff make meaningful connections with families by building trusting relationships. Stephanie also moderates CAPNA's Lived Experiences Affinity Group meetings each month where staff share their personal stories with a variety of experiences, primarily relating to events resulting in traumatic outcomes. Welcome, Stephanie.
Thank you for having me.
We appreciate you being here to talk about lived experiences with children and adults and how that affects the family engagement process and the development of children and families overall.
Okay.
So we'll start with some data from the National Institutes of Health. Recent national estimates indicate that as many as 60% of adults in the U.S. experienced at least one adverse childhood experience, or ACE, as children. A key finding is a consistent linear relationship between the number of adverse events experienced and the likelihood of negative consequences. The National Institutes of Health published findings in 2019 noting that adverse child experiences have long-term health consequences, even more so for young children in the southern U.S. For those listening who may not have heard the term adverse childhood experiences, what does that actually mean?
I would like to sum it up like this: the scars of life that people don't ask for. And things that trauma, abuse, whether it's emotional, sexual, or neglect, depression, addiction, and I like to add rejection to that. That's how I would just sum it up, the scars of life that most people experience. To me, some things you see and some things you don't see.
What are some things in your experience with families? What are the adverse experiences that you've witnessed from the periphery?
Well, a lot of things that we see is perhaps alcohol abuse, drug abuse, physical abuse, emotional abuse. Those are a lot of things that we see in our program on a day-to-day. And I would like to say that the domestic abuse, we don't see it. However, it's if you pay attention to individuals, if you get to build relationships with families, then you can also notice those things. Those are things that's the unseen. But children tend to act those other things out, you know.
What does that look like for a 3-year-old or a 4-year-old when they grow up that way?
Well, I think that they respond to it. I was thinking about that, they respond to it if it goes untreated in their life, their personal life. So then they act out and they do those things. And they repeat it. It's like a cycle and it's repeated. I want to say this, if I can, about
of course.
ACE. The curse of it are those people who hide it or camouflage any of those things that they may have experienced. And sometimes you ask that question. Sometimes they don't. When they become adults, if it's untreated, sometimes they may have experienced something, and they don't seek treatment for it out of fear. You know, I'm just out of fear, and the reason why sometimes it's that they have maybe lack of hope or no hope of anything being done because that's what they're familiar with. And so, I just wanted to mention that anything that's undetected or untreated can't heal. I think about it because, like, I have a scar on my hand, so you can see it, right? And so I put ointment on it because I can see it. But when you're exposed to things within your home, any type of abuse or neglect, you're afraid, especially as a child. You're afraid of the what if. What if I told someone and they removed me from the home? If you are an individual, an adult in the home, if you're experiencing abuse, verbal, physical abuse, and you might be afraid of, where am I going to go, right? Who's going to, take care of me and my children, those type of things. And those things impact what we do, what Head Start does. And then when I talk about camouflage, when people come into our centers, they're hiding. We all. I don't think it's called hiding. I think we call it our private life. and if we don't pay attention to individuals, or get to know them and pay attention to those things, we can't help them, and they lose that hope. And then, as an adult, I was downloaded to my kids, and then they grow up and they think that's normal. If that makes sense.
It's so many of us, you say out of fear, people don't get help. Mm-hmm. And we have seen, we being the people who are not professionals, we see what happens through the media and through movies, television, even documentaries, that folks who don't get help wind up, they may live in the streets, they may be in prostitution, they may be involved in other activities like drug abuse. Yeah. How does the Family Services program help families when you see them come in and you recognize there's abuse? As mandatory reporters, you report those things.
Yeah, we do.
How will your services change the trajectory for those families and those children?
Well, that's a good question. So I like to think of it as, like, for me, I'm not in the field, so I have, we train staff, is that we have to pay attention. So no matter what we do, no matter, what position you're in, you always have to, I'll just have to say, you have to, in this type of work, I apologize, you have to build relationships. Otherwise, you're not going to recognize it. You're just not. And so you can't change the trajectory if you don't pay attention to what's in front of you. And when people are hiding, I don't want to say hiding, I think that word, private. And when people tend to keep things private, then they can't change it. They can't change it on their own, and we can't change it if we don't have a relationship. How do you recognize something if you don't communicate with people? Like, if you had something going on, if I saw you every day, and if you had a child in our program, and if I saw you every day, and if I didn't notice things about you, how can I help you? How can I help you? You've worked in the classroom before. You had to pay attention. You had to do checks with children. But what did you look at when the parents come in? You have to look at the same thing. I think that in a way, we try to do that, but we get caught up in we got to do this, and this. So one of the biggest things that I try to do with staff is say, build relationships so you become aware. And when children start to change, when they act out, that's one thing that we know in a classroom. If that's one of the questions I ask, I had a situation where an FES, Family Engagement Specialist, called, and a child started to do something. We were probably 3 months in the program, and a child started to do things in the classroom, maybe wet their pants. And this has never happened before, but the last couple of weeks, this child had started doing this. And one of the first questions I asked the FES was, have you noticed anything change in the family? And when I asked her that, she paused and she said, you know, I noticed something about the mom, and I don't think the dad is there anymore. And so the child was experiencing separation. So what is that? That's a response to his environment. And so when you put him in this environment, you know, something that he's familiar with our classrooms, but yet what's still in his mind is what's going on at home. And so that was a response to what's happening in his home. And the parent never told the staff person, but the staff person started to think about, you know, hey, Dad was bringing this kid. Now I see the mom every day. And so
and she protected the information.
Yeah, she withheld that information, and the staff person didn't think about it, you know. And so I gave her some tips on, you know, how to approach the mom without, you know, overstepping, you know, our boundaries.
I want to ask you about the role of trauma and poverty in the lives of families. In 2020, Forbes mentioned that poverty, neglect, housing, instability, violence, food insecurity, and separation from parents all affect childhood development, which is what you just touched on, is a separation from a parent, and thus lifelong health. Although children are born ready to learn and grow, adverse childhood experiences are traumatic events that occur in youth, resulting in toxic stress. As the CAPNA Family Service Manager, how do ACEs play a role in young children's ability to learn, especially those who are living in poverty?
I'll answer that question. I sort of answered that question before, but I'll go back to toxic stress. But I want to mention this. I just mentioned this. When you're hurting and that hurt goes untreated, and you're putting them in an environment that's not familiar with you, so you respond. I want to sum this up. Like, you respond like a fish that's out of water. You know, we all seen fish, you know, flap when they're out of water. Whether it's not so much a negative response, I'm just saying you're looking to survive. And so I wanted to mention that's how children who are dealing with ACE at home, and then they come into our environment. And we're trying to do things, we have structure. And when they're exposed to that, as I gave you the example of the child wetting, you know, himself, so they're trying to adapt in their little brains, you know, how to survive in this setting. The parent, you know, is helping them at home, you know, probably the best way they can. And so now they got to figure out how to survive here. But I wanted to mention something about toxic stress, because I thought about this, that is two words that are joined together like a forbidden marriage, right? Toxic stress. And what's in and around it, whether it's our classrooms or our community, this is the way I sum it up, is considered casualties. Toxic stress. So there's going to be casualties if we don't help them, if we can't help it, if people don't talk about it. There's going to be, and so I just wanted to mention that. And then I thought about it. Just imagine two individuals who have experienced ACE as children. Then they grow up and they marry. And then what happens? Especially if those two individuals didn't receive the care or the treatment that they needed. And so what happens is then they, you know, there's children, then they have children, and they repeat. It's a cycle repeated. I think, and then we have an environment where they're trying to survive, especially now in this day and age, social media. So, and they see things, and then they act out like what they see. To me, it just breaks my heart because I get it. I get the part where you want to keep your private life private, but if it's hurting someone inside of your camp, just know it's going to hurt someone outside. That's what I'm saying in your environment. When we put children in our classrooms, the way we try to have the structure that we try to present to them, it doesn't look like their home. And then they're one individual, but then when you then there's 13 other children in the classroom. Out of those, there may, even though we're we serve low-income families, there are some kids in there who don't experience what they experience. So then you're putting these kids that are in that classroom, and they're trying to adapt, and sometimes it's difficult. That's why we see the behavior issues.
I think about your fish analogy, and it makes me think of you're the only goldfish in an ocean full of sharks. At least that's the way you may feel if you're a small child. Right. So how do you adapt to that environment? And when you mentioned the fish, that's what that made me think about. Yeah. If we don't get to the triage part, then at some point we end up in the emergency room or intensive care.
Right. And you're trying to survive. Whether you're the teachers in the classroom, you're trying to survive. If you're a family engagement specialist, you're trying to, help a family, or you're trying to survive because you don't know what's going on. Why is this child this way? The mother or the dad seems normal, but the word is seems, and then I guess what's normal, but they seem. That's only what you see. I talked about scars. There's visible scars, and then those that's not. Like, people camouflage them. And our favorite word when I say camouflage is, I'm good.
How are you? Fine.
I'm good. Yeah, I'm fine. So, and sometimes they're not. They're hurting. So, but that's what I see.
Do you have a story, personally or professionally, that can help our listeners relate to the effects of adverse childhood experiences on children and adults?
Well, I would like to say this, is that I do have a personal story, and right off, I don't want to, not everybody can handle, or we all handle the situations different, circumstances differently. But I'll give an example of myself, a personal one, and there's more to it, but I'll just mention this. Of course, my experience with ACEs was incarceration, my dad, and then also domestic abuse. And so my dad took my mom's life. And I was 12. And I think that we went to live with my grandparents. In that time, in that generation, formal treatment was not offered, and my grandparents did the best that they could. So I do want to recognize that. And their way of communicating was okay, so let's just go to church, right? And that was one of the general responses to a lot of things in my growing up, the church. And so formal care, counseling, that wasn't something that we offered, and we kept things hush-hush during that time. So I mentioned that. So I recall a situation where my dad went, he was up for parole, and I was about 24. I think it was before I gave birth to my first child. And I was married, and he wanted to live with me because I had room, and I had talked to my husband at the time, and I just didn't want that. For me, my dad never apologized, and I was around my dad, because he would get to come home on weekends. He was, and so I recall one day, and he wanted to talk to me. I knew what it was, and he wanted to talk to me, and so we met at the restaurant in which he was working, and I went to him, and I was nervous, and he said, he asked me, and I was quivering. The reason why I'm telling this story is because the child in me, when that happened, was the person in front of him. You know, that I was that 12-year-old kid, you know, and I knew as an adult, the 24-year-old, I wanted to say no, but the 12-year-old who had experienced this, but the trauma went back, well, you know, because I grew up in a home where there was physical abuse. There was, you know, it was nothing for you to wake up in the middle of the night and your parents were fighting. That was normal to me. That was normal to me. And so that went prior to me being 12. And so anyway, so he asked me, I was like, no, you can't live with me. And, you know, my hands were shaking. And so at that moment, he understood. And so, and he understood. And, you know, we exchanged words about how I felt. And it's like in that moment, he apologized for what he had done. And then I forgave him. So that's why I was saying that not everybody is probably there. But what I wanted to also add to that story is when I look back as a child going through, I didn't act out in school, but I always felt rejected. I always felt rejected.
Say more about that.
Because living in a home where there was domestic abuse in my and then losing my mother, because I felt like that was the only person that loved me, even though it was opposite in, you know, like feeling not loved. Well, my mom loved me, but I didn't feel that way after her, right? So I always felt rejected my whole life up until that moment. And nobody knew it. I made friends, but nobody knew it. So I went through high school until that moment. So if you don't hone in to people, you won't know. But I had some good teachers, right? And they cared about me. And I could have done the opposite, but gratefully, I had something that I could do, like I played sports. And so and that was a way for me to live and hide my scars.
So when did you feel like you turned the corner and you no longer felt rejected?
Well, okay, so, when I married my first husband, and he showed me love, right? And so, but I really have to say, honestly, it was that very moment I felt different after my dad saying he understood and he apologized for taking the person that I love the most. And not that I love my dad, don't get me wrong, but for him to apologize to me, because for me, I was a victim, but the word was. And so, and then for me to forgive him, I felt like a weight was lifted. My voice didn't quiver anymore after he and I talked. And we talked, and we actually, had a relationship. And so, and then when I gave birth to children, and then when I divorced their dad, I offered counseling to them. because I knew that they would need more than me and church. I knew that they, so I offered it to them. But anything untreated, it can't heal. It can't get well, Holly. So, and I don't blame our parents. I don't blame them, because if that's all you know, then you think that that's the way it's supposed to be. If that makes sense.
When you know better, you do better.
Yeah, and so we have so many kids, in our program that hurt. They literally hurt, and we could do a lot for them. We really could. We really can. I guess sometimes I might be a little firm with staff, but when you are one of them, like if you see yourself in those children, doesn't matter what color they are, if you see yourself in those children, there is different. They can have a different life. Not to say that their life is not good, but different. If you expose them to something else, just like catching a fish, if you throw it back in the water, they'll learn to survive. But first, you gotta help them understand what these survival skills that they need in order to live.
Who do you think is the most responsible for the families moving ahead? Are the families responsible, or is the government responsible, like mental health support, or just the community?
Everybody is responsible. We are responsible for ourselves, right? So I have to say that as adults. But what we invest in our children, we will receive that when they grow up. So I want to invest. So when I talk about investing, a lot of times money is great. We want to invest money into it. We also want to invest time. We want to invest patience. People need our patience, and people need our grace, because it takes time to heal from a scar that's probably been around for a long time. And and we need to invest love in individuals. But it takes everybody to be on board. Organizations like ourselves, our agencies, also, like you talked about, local, state, and federal government. Everybody is at stake. Remember, I made the comment about casualties. Well, if we don't invest in our children, there's going to be casualties along the way. There are going to be casualties locally, at a national level, at a state level. So we have to invest in what we want to see different. We talk about it, but are we really investing in it? So, but it's everybody has to be going in the same direction. We might be doing different things, but we have to be going in the same direction.
What I hear you say is to invest in the treatment for people with these experiences affects everybody.
Yes.
Not just people who've experienced trauma.
Exactly.
But anyone can become a casualty of trauma.
Anyone can become a casualty of trauma. And also, I was going to mention this too, is, and then there's a preventive care that we have to also invest in. And so sometimes it's not always what people have experienced, but let's work on things where they don't have to experience that, so they don't, if we invest right, then those things can, we'll see the fruit of what our investments. That's what I'll say that.
I think that's a perfect way to end our conversation.
Thank you.
Stephanie, thank you so much for joining us and sharing your experience with us.